I know. Okay. Okay. Now we have sound. Good afternoon. I know people are still coming in. I know it's hard to find parking in Harvard Square in the best of times, and a fall afternoon when the weather is good is not necessarily the best of times. So there may still be people joining us. But I want to get started. Welcome to Cambridge Forum and this special collaboration with Penn New England today. I'm Pat Zerke, the director of the forum, and I am very happy to welcome all of you here for this tribute to Howard Zinn and his lifelong support for the freedom to write. Cambridge Forum is all about the free exchange of ideas, and Howard Zinn has spoken at Cambridge Forum on a number of occasions, so I'm delighted to be a partner with Penn New England today in tribute to him. A few brief announcements before the formal program starts. First, if you want to receive information about Cambridge Forum and about our future programs, there's a list on the table in the foyer, and it will move to the place the program ends. You can sign up, give us your email address or your snail mail address, and we will send you information about our future programs. There's also information there about reserving a CD of today's program and about our support group, the Friends of Cambridge Forum. It is thanks to the donations of our friends that we have been able to present these free public programs for 44 years. And you are all friends or potential friends of Cambridge Forum. So if you choose to make a donation in support of our public programs, we are grateful and we thank you. As many of you know, Cambridge Forum is a participatory program. Our programs are recorded and edited and produced as public radio broadcasts. And in addition, WGBH is here today. They are doing a video recording of the program, and it will be available on the Forum Network website they host as a webcast and a downloadable MP3 file. So we ask that when you ask questions of the panelists after their formal remarks, you come forward and use the microphone here at the head of the center aisle. That way your question in your voice will be recorded as well as the speaker's responses. And of course, by coming forward to that microphone, you are giving us permission to record you, edit you, broadcast you, webcast you, and even let people jog with you on their MP3 players. So we record everything. There is one thing we don't want to record, and you all know what that is. That is the ringing of your cell phone or other electronic device. So now is the time to turn those things off. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you that Richard Hoffman, the chair of Penn New England, will be our moderator for the first part of the program. He's an award-winning prose and poetry writer. Richard's most recent collection of short stories, Interference, came out from New Rivers Press in 2009, and he is currently a writer-in-residence at Emerson College. Here's Richard Hoffman to present the Freedom to Write Awards.
Thank you, Pat, and welcome, everyone. I want to thank our partners, the Cambridge Forum and Amnesty International, for helping us mount today's program. In addition to our panel discussing the literary presence of Howard Zinn, his commitment to other writers, independent booksellers, small presses, and magazines, we will today be presenting 2 awards to honor writers of exemplary courage. The first, Penn New England's Vassal Stuss Freedom to Write Award, recognizes a writer who has been persecuted for the peaceful expression of his or her views and whose courage in the face of censorship and oppression has been exemplary. The Vassal Stuss Award is named in honor of a Ukrainian poet who became the leading voice of his generation. A man of uncompromising principles, Stuss refused to capitulate to a repressive regime and was subjected to constant persecutions which finally were responsible for his death. This year's honoree is the Burmese poet and comedian Maung Tura, who writes under the pen name Zargana. Zargana's poetry has been published in the international pen anthology, This Prison Where I Live. His comedy is a form of political activism which would be familiar to fans of Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, Dick Gregory, or Dario Fo. Arrested in 2008 for a variety of censorious reasons, Zargana has 35 years remaining of his sentence. He's been denied visits from his family, and there are serious concerns for his well-being. These concerns that as an opposition voice with a broad base of popular support, he might be especially targeted for abuse, make it all the more important that we raise awareness of his situation. As always, we must present the award in absentia. And although we haven't yet found the means by which to make this award to Maung Tura or to his immediate family, we will persist in our efforts to do so. However, because this afternoon's proceedings are to be captured by WGBH, broadcast, and available worldwide on the internet, I want you to please follow my announcement of this award with your most enthusiastic, vocal, and loud approbation and applause, so that the Burmese authorities may know for certain that Zargana, the writer and performer dear to the people of Burma, and whom we consider a citizen of our International Republic of Letters, is not forgotten, is not to be mistreated, and is to be released. So on behalf of PEN New England and its Freedom to Write Committee, it gives me great pleasure to present the Vassalstus Freedom to Write Award to the Burmese writer Zargana for his courage in the face of censorship and repression. Hear, hear! Now I'd like to take a moment before the presentation of our next award to draw your attention to the final note on your program. After today's panel with Amnesty International, we will gather to sign letters protesting the imprisonment and oppression of writers around the world, an activity perfectly in the spirit of Howard Zinn, who understood perhaps better than any of us the best way to combine literature and activism. Sometimes people wonder if something as simple as a letter or a postcard can possibly make a difference. We know that it can, that it does, because of the testimony of people like our special guest today. A journalist from Sri Lanka, J.S. Tesaniyagam, is currently a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. He was detained in Sri Lanka on March 7, 2008, and charged under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for articles about the conduct of security forces during the Civil War and its impact on civilians. After Amnesty International adopted him as a prisoner of conscience, he was released in 2010. He is here today with his wife, Ronette, and he would like to take just a moment to thank people for their support.
Well, all I can say is thank you very, very much. I was, as it was explained a little while ago, I was detained for 20 years for my writing against political oppression, against what the military was and is doing in Sri Lanka. And the government of that country detained me for 20 years. I am here today because of the unceasing efforts of PEN and Amnesty International and other organizations as well. and whose letters and various other forms of pressurizing, peacefully pressurizing the Sri Lanka government, finally won me my freedom. I thank all of you very, very much. Thank you very much.
The Penn New England Thomas Paine Award is given to an American writer who has shown courage in the face of attempts, particular or general, to silence his or her voice, who has spoken truth to power or otherwise been a dissident voice. Previous winners of this award include Anthony Lewis for his writings prior to the Iraq War, and Piri Thomas, author of Down These Mean Streets. It gives me great pleasure, inflected with sadness, to present posthumously the Penn New England Thomas Paine Award to Howard Zinn. Dr. Zinn's daughter, Mila Cabot Zinn, will accept the award, after which I will have one more brief announcement before we begin our panel discussion. Mila.
Just want to thank Penn New England for this wonderful honor. I feel very touched. I know our family is very moved by this, and I can't think, I mean, my father, I feel like in some ways I've gotten to know him even better since he died in January, and they have become aware of all the unbelievable ways in which he did speak truth to power, and wrote truth to power, and all the forms that that took. And even in the last, I mean, right up until the time he died, he was doing that. And so this is, means a great deal. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll join you in a moment. And now I would like to announce that this year's Penn New England Thomas Paine Award will be the last one bestowed by Penn New England, because by unanimous vote of the Executive Board of Penn New England, this award will henceforth be known as the Howard Zinn Voice of the People Award. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to the moderator of today's panel, Helen Atwan. I will let you introduce yourself, Helen. So please welcome our panel.
Thank you all. It was very moving. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to introduce myself and mention the panelists in a minute and let them actually introduce themselves more fully. But I wanted to start by just noting what Mila just told us is just how many ways Howard contributed to the writing life of this country, to the intellectual life of this country. And here we are hardly the first group to pay homage to Howard Zinn. In fact, we're vying with many other wonderful tributes to his work and homages by figures no less important than Pearl Jam and Matt Damon and A.J. Soprano and Marge Simpson, but among others. But we're here to do something pretty special today. I think you all know Howard Zinn as a great historian, author, playwright, public intellectual, and above all, as an activist. But today, we're paying tribute to Howard Zinn as a champion of other writers and of independent presses. I might also mention, as Richard did in the context of Penn, that he was also a tremendous supporter of magazines and journals and of booksellers, especially independent booksellers, and they're all part of this enormous writing community that owes so much to Howard. I don't think we could possibly do justice to all that Howard Zinn did to support the writing community in just a little over an hour, but I think we can touch on at least some highlights. And so I'm going to be speaking briefly, and then I'm going to let our other panelists speak. And our panelists today are Martín Espada, a poet and essayist who teaches at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst; Marc Favreau, the editorial director of the New Press, which also published many of Zinn's works in recent decades; and Dave Zinn, an author and sports editor for The Nation. And as I said, each of them will say a little more about their own work in relation to Howard's contribution to that work. I think everyone in this room knows that Howard Zinn grew up in Brooklyn, the son of an immigrant factory workers, but that they filled their house with books and encouraged a love of reading from his earliest days, and books were part of his life from that time forward. He published after having returned from war and gone to college on the GI Bill. He began publishing books as a historian, and I'm proud to say that he published his second book with Beacon Press. That was back in 1964. Famously, of course, Howard and his friend and colleague Noam Chomsky edited the Pentagon Papers, which we published in 5 volumes in 1971. And we were lucky enough to publish other books of his in that decade, some with Daniel Berrigan, and they included, of course, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. And in 1994, the year before I became the director of Beacon, we published his memoir, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. One of my very favorite lines from that book was quoted in his Globe obit. I just can't resist reading it. He wrote, "I wanted students to leave my classes not just better informed, but better prepared to relinquish the safety of silence, more prepared to speak up, to act against injustice wherever they saw it." This, of course, was a recipe for trouble. Just love that, the way that Howard would put in that little zinger in so much of his writing and so many of his speeches. So from shortly after I arrived at Beacon Press, I discovered that I had a friend in Howard Zinn. He took me to lunch. He paid. Very rare thing. He advised me. He sent authors to me. He read manuscripts for me. And in fact, he liked way too many of them. I think he was the definition of generous to a fault at times. He also willingly wrote blurbs for our books and even prefaces. And we used to joke that Beacon would one day publish the collected preface of Howard Zinn in 3 volumes. It was always his sense, imbued from childhood, that books mattered. So writers mattered, and publishers mattered, and journals mattered, and booksellers mattered. And he was in every way about to support them in any way he could. I asked him to speak for free several times in support of Beacon Press. He always said yes. Once flying to Miami just to speak about the 150th anniversary of Beacon Press. Authors don't usually do that kind of thing. I think those of you in the audience who are authors know that. But we were hardly his only publishers. He knew how to spread the wealth. I won't read the entire list, but I'm just going to mention a few of the other publishers that he was so generous with. Paradigm Publishers, South End Press, Common Courage Press, City Lights Publishers, and the New Press, and Seven Stories. And in fact, Dan Simon, the head of Seven Stories, who was a lifelong friend of Howie's, sent me this letter, which I'd like to read you an excerpt of. This is Dan Simon, Seven Stories Press. Howard was unofficially my godfather from the time I was about 9 years old, when my mother was a colleague of his at BU. Without him as one of our top-selling authors, without him and Roz both as founding advisory board members, and without them both as inspirations to me in the founding and sustaining of an alternative institution as a worthy project, Seven Stories would never have lasted as long as it has. They were a part of a better world, the advance guard, if you will, and I'd like to think that we, including our authors, readers, staff, are also part of that better world. But they were the beacon, and he says, no pun intended, that shined the way. I can't say how proud I was to work with him on his last book, 3 plays, but perhaps there will be other books, posthumous books. I suspect there will be, and I hope there will be. Each book by Howard Zinn is a treasure. Each of the books that he lovingly helped godfather or shepherd into print is a treasure, and we have a great debt to him. So now for an author's perspective, I'm going to call on Martin Espada.
Thank you. I am very glad and very honored to have this opportunity to talk to you about my friend Howard. In particular, I want to say something about Howard's influence on my work as a poet. Now, that influence often took the form of showing me that I belonged to a tradition, a history of radical writers. Howard not only supported and promoted contemporary writers like myself, he also championed writers of the past who were either consigned to oblivion or sanitized due to their politics. I had no idea, for example, that Millay, Shelley, and Cummings all wrote fierce poems of political dissent. Howard educated me about the hidden legacy of these poets, and therefore taught me something about myself. Howard wrote a brief essay, which I edited for the Poets Against War website, called Rise Like Lions. The title comes from Shelley. In my opening statement today, I'd like to read a few passages and quote a few poems from this essay. We'll hear Howard's voice and the voices within his voice, which is just as important. Rise like lions, writers in resistance. Whenever I become discouraged, which is on alternate Tuesdays between 3 and 4, I lift my spirits by remembering the writers are on our side. I mean, those poets, novelists, playwrights, and songwriters who speak to the world in a way that is impervious to assault, because they wage the battle for justice in a sphere which is unreachable by the dullness of ordinary political discourse. The billionaire mandarins of our culture can show us the horrors of war on a movie screen and pretend they are making an important statement. War is hell, says the general, as he orders his troops forward into no man's land. But the artists go beyond that to resistance, defiance. I think of Edna St. Vincent Millay in her poem, Conscientious Objector. I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. I hear him leading his horse out of the stall. I hear the clatter on the barn floor. He is in haste. He has business in Cuba, business in the Balkans, many calls to make this morning. But I will not hold the bridle while he cinches the girth, and he may mount by himself. I will not give him a leg up. Though he flick my shoulders with his whip, I will not tell him which way the fox ran. With his hoof on my breast, I will not tell him where the black boy hides in the swamp. I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. I am not on his payroll. E. Cummings, whose own experience with the First World War had powerfully affected him, see his memoir, The Enormous Room, wrote in the same vein, but in his own unique style. I sing of Olaf, glad and big, whose warmest heart recoiled at war, a conscientious objector. But, though all kinds of officers, a yearning nation's blue-eyed pride, their passive prey did kick and curse, Olaf, upon what were once knees, does almost ceaselessly repeat, there is some shit I will not eat. There is a touch or more of the anarchist in writers who, with some shameful exceptions, those who rush to kiss the flag when the trumpets blow, will not go along even with good wars. Thus, Kurt Vonnegut did not hesitate in the midst of the self-congratulation that accompanied victory in World War II to remind the nation of Dresden. His book, Slaughterhouse-Five, held us to the mirror of our ruthlessness and that of all nations which pretend to moral superiority while joining the enemy in the back and forth of atrocities. Eugene O'Neill, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, wrote to his son, "It is like acid always burning in my brain that the stupid butchering of the last war taught men nothing at all, that they sank back listlessly on the warm manure pile of the dead and went to sleep, indifferently bestowing custody of their future, their fate, into the hands of state departments whose members are trained to be conspirators, card sharps, double-crossers, and secret betrayers of their own people, into the hands of greedy capitalist ruling classes so stupid they could not even see when their own greed began devouring itself, in the hands of that most debased type of pimp, the politician, and the most craven of all lice and job worshippers, the bureaucrats." The barrage of film and books glorifying World War II, The Greatest Generation, Saving Private Ryan, Pearl Harbor, Flags of Our Fathers, and more, comes at a time when it is necessary for the establishment to do what it must periodically do: try to wipe out of the public mind the ugly stain of the war in Vietnam, and now that the aura around the Gulf War has turned sour, to forget that too. A justification is needed for the enormous military budget, and so the good war, the best war, is trundled out to give war a good name. The great writers could see through the fog of what was called patriotism, what was considered loyalty. Mark Twain, in his brilliant satire, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, puts it this way: "You see, my kind of loyalty was loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions or its office holders. The country is the real thing, the substantial thing, the eternal thing. It is the thing to watch over and care for and be loyal to. Its institutions are extraneous. They are its mere clothing, and clothing can wear out, become ragged, cease to be comfortable, cease to protect the body from winter, disease, and death. To be loyal to rags, to shout for rags, to worship rags, to die for rags, that is a loyalty of unreason." George Bernard Shaw, unsure perhaps if the message of his plays was clear, stated his philosophy boldly in his prefaces, as in this one from Major Barbara. "I am, and have always been, and shall now always be, a revolutionary writer, because our laws make laws impossible. Our liberties destroy all freedom. Our property is organized robbery. Our morality is an impudent hypocrisy. Our power wielded by cowards and weaklings, and our honor false in all its points. I am an enemy of the existing order. Today, Arundhati Roy, author of The God of Small Things, has linked her energy as a citizen to her brilliance as a novelist to join the struggle in India to save the land and the people from the ravages of greedy corporations. The great writers of the world have almost always been on the side of the poor, from Dickens to Tolstoy to Balzac to John Steinbeck. Percy Bysshe Shelley, in his passionate poem The Mask of Anarchy, wrote 5 powerful lines that, later, in the early 20th century United States, would be read aloud by garment workers to one another. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for bringing us Howard's words, too. Mark Favreau of New Press.
So I'm from the New Press. We're an independent publisher in New York, founded in 1990. And we, like Beacon and so many other presses, we try to think of ourselves as part of the infrastructure for progressive politics, for independent writing, independent voices. And Howard was such an important part of that as well, and in so many tangible ways supported our work that I found it difficult to fit all that into a short presentation. So I'll just light on a few things that he did for us, and it just gives me so much pleasure to be able to add to the public record, because I think so much of this work, as Helen said, Howard did quietly and behind the scenes in a completely informal way, and that makes it all the more impressive for that. I looked back last week into our earliest catalogs at the New Press in the early 90s, and I lit on one of our first books, which was called A People's History of the United States, The Wall Charts, which sounds funny. Actually, it was a really lovely classroom project with posters that illustrated in a wonderful visual way the primary arguments of Howard's main book. And this has been adopted widely over the last 2 decades. And so in doing so, I dug into our early correspondence files, this being the years before email, so there's all sorts of wonderful letters back and forth. And I uncovered letter after letter from Howard urging us on. This is well before my time at the New Press, so it was kind of a wonderful discovery. Being open to still new suggestions for books, offering words of support, and critically, words of endorsement for our early titles. Among many other projects that involved his collaboration at the New Press, we subsequently published teaching editions of the People's History, which have not only been perennials on our list, but more importantly, truly vital tools for getting Howard's work into secondary school classrooms. Anyone who's worked in independent publishing knows how critical this kind of support is, particularly in the early years when someone's willingness to give you projects to publish is so essential to the work of credentializing a new imprint, because part of what we do is to offer a credential so that a new author can find a voice in a broader world. And so for established voices to lend themselves to your effort is truly, it's impossible to put a price tag on that. So a decade or so later, I came on the scene, and being mainly interested in editing history, I came up from New York City to Cambridge, and I met with Howard right near here at the Algiers. And I remember him saying that he liked the place because it seemed vaguely a conspiratorial setting for the kind of conversation we were up to. So at this really wonderful meeting was the first time I'd met him. We launched what we eventually called the New Press People's History series. It was to be edited by Howard, and the idea was to take the impulse behind his great narrative synthesis and to extend it into new fields. And it's worked brilliantly. We've published 10 of these books over the last decade. And I have to admit, at the time, myself in particular, I expected Howard would lend his name to this project, but would not otherwise have the time to keep close tabs on the work. But far from it, Howard funneled names to us constantly. He sent proposals our way, new ideas. He vetted manuscripts. He bugged me constantly for steady updates of the work. And he pushed me and my colleagues to expand the boundaries of the series and to build the list of authors we were in touch with. The series, under Zinn's name and editorship, has truly provided a means for incredibly promising young authors, many of them emerging, many of them interested in making a broader political statement, to find a much more substantial readership than they otherwise would have, and to find a home at a publishing house. I wanted to say that looking back over a decade of correspondence, now much of it on email, the one thing I'd like to highlight here is that a person like Zinn, a great public, very much a motivational figure for many people, he gets a lot of emails, he got a lot of letters, people approached him at public events, and yet I have yet to find an instance where someone said that he or she couldn't get through to him, or that he didn't respond. Howard was accessible. You could approach him, you could talk to him, get his feedback on things. And for a very busy, very sought-after person, that's an amazing thing to say. It's an amazing characteristic. So I just wanted us, when we take account of Howard Zinn's influence on the world of politics and activism and ideas, I hope that this generosity, this rich engagement with people, will be taken into account. And in thinking about this panel, I sent missives out to everyone I dealt with at the New Press that had also worked with Howard. And of the responses I got back, I want to read a really precious one that came via email from Nicholas Lampert, who's a wonderful young radical graphic artist in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who's writing a book for us in the series entitled A People's Art History of the United States. Nicholas wrote the following words. In 2003, I invited Howard to speak to my students at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. Prior to the event, I drove to Madison to meet Howard, where he had given a lecture the night before at the Orpheum Theater. I had never met Howard, and I was excited to spend 2 hours with a person that I admired so much. I expected to ask Howard a zillion questions about his life and views on current politics, but when we set out on the journey back to Milwaukee, Howard was the one who asked the questions. He didn't want to talk about himself. He wanted to know about me, about my family, about what social justice movements I had taken part in. He wanted to know more about the struggles in Milwaukee. When I told him that I was an artist and was writing about the visual resistance against the Iraq War, the remainder of the conversation focused on art and the role that artists played in movements. Near the end of the trip, Howard told me about the New Press People's History series and suggested that I send him a one-page proposal for a people's art history of the U.S. that he would pass on to Mark. That's me. I couldn't believe my good fortune. In one unbelievable day, I met Howard, introduced him to my students, and was inspired by his suggestion to embark on a major book project. In the years that followed writing the manuscript, I would mail Howard an essay or two to let him know how the project was progressing. His responses were always prompt and full of encouragement. My favorite response was a closing sentence that read, "So keep going, write for justice, write standing up." Thank you.
Yeah.
Dave Zarin.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. How you doing? That's it? It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here to speak about Howard, especially on a dais with Helen, Martina Spada, and Mark Favreau. And I'm a sports writer by trade, and so I could very well understand it if people wonder what the heck I'm doing up here. And that would be a fair question. But I can say with utter honesty and truthfulness that I wouldn't be able to do what I do for a living if not for Howard Zinn's direct generosity and influence on my own career. And I always said to him that for a Red Sox fan, he was a pretty nice guy. Bad crowd for that. For me, it really started when I wrote a book for a small press called What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States. And the title of it, What's My Name, Fool? Was taken from a line that Muhammad Ali would say when he would be in the ring, particularly against a fighter named Ernie Terrell, who insisted on calling him Cassius Clay. And so he would pepper him with punches and say my name, what's my name, fool? It's like, I'm going to teach him respect. I'm going to teach him to call me Muhammad Ali. And the book is about the historic intersection between sports and politics, where athletes had used sports as a way to speak out for social justice. Now, my editors were not very optimistic about the project, to put it mildly, because their contention was it's going to upset sports lovers because sports lovers don't want politics in their sports, and it's going to annoy political people who think sports is basically a wholly owned subsidiary of Glenn Beck Incorporated. So, and I was like, so then why are you publishing it, was a question. So, but we sent the book out, we tried to get some blurbs, tried to get it some nice mention, and much to my absolute delight, Howard agreed to write a blurb for the book. Now, this was something Howard did. I think his blurbs are on more books than the New York Times book review section. He was very generous with that. But I was thrilled because I'd seen Howard speak at that point since I was a teenager back in the early 90s. Anytime he came through town, wherever I was, I would go hear him speak. And the idea that this person who I admired so much in these big crowds was writing a blurb for the book, I mean, that in and of itself, like, I didn't care if the book sold 5 copies. I was just thrilled to death. But where Howard really made a difference was I was going to do an event in Boston for the book, and I was going to be an event at Brookline Bookstore, and I thought the crowd was going to be my friends and whatever family would come up from New York. And it was suggested to me that I get in touch with Howard and see if he would speak with me at this event. And so I did, not really knowing why he would say yes. And he said yes. He said he'd love to. And then I thought, it would be great to get a sports person up there too. So I asked Howard if it would be all right if I contacted a guy named Jim Bouton, who is a 20-game winner for the New York Yankees, and he wrote one of the great rebellious sports books of all time, a book called Ball 4. And much to my surprise and delight, not only had Howard read Ball 4, not only had he heard of Jim Bouton, but he was just tickled at the thought of speaking with him. And then I got in touch with Jim Bouton, and Jim Bouton was over the moon when he heard that Howard Zinn was going to be there. And it was so funny because Jim Bouton said, oh my God, I'd never met him, but I've been in crowds a lot of times and heard him speak. And I was like, that's what I said. And so the three of us did this event together, and instead we had to do it at the big movie theater across the street from the Brookline Booksmith, I believe it's called. That's right. And so instead of me by myself in front of a handful of people, it was a couple hundred people packed in the room to hear Howard Zinn. And I was able to have this moment where I got to introduce Howard Zinn and Jim Bouton in the back room beforehand, and they were both like couple of grinning teenagers. Like, Howard was thrilled. He's like to meet someone who pitched in the major leagues and wrote Ball 4, and Jim Bouton was thrilled to meet Howard Zinn, and I was so psyched to even make the connection, because that was kind of the point of the book, is to bring politics and history and sports together. And now here we're doing it in the green room before this event. And the event, I did my presentation, Jim did his presentation, and then Howard stood up and he said, I don't know too much about sports or sports history, but I have to say, everything I did learn, I learned from reading Dave Zirin's book, and he held it up. And it was just this remarkably generous, self-effacing thing to do. And this is a totally true story. I walked out of the meeting just on air about how it went, and I bumped into Peter Gammons. Do people know who that is? He's the longtime baseball writer for the Boston Globe. This is just by chance. It was like an episode of The Love Boat, celebrities everywhere. And so there's Peter Gammons, and I say, Peter Gammons, are you here because Jim Bouton and Howard Zinn are here with me doing this? And he was like, no, this is my favorite place to get coffee. And I said, okay, well, it's great to meet you. It's an honor. I've been reading you for years. And then Peter Gammons said, is Howard Zinn in there? And I said, yeah. And he said, oh my God, I've never met Howard Zinn. I've heard him speak many times. And it's just so funny to me and so interesting that Howard, who always, not unlike his dear friend Noam Chomsky, always got the short end when it came to being like a commentator on CNN or MSNBC. You know, the big shows never called upon our treasured radicals to actually give opinion about the events shaping our times. Yet Howard was so known on such a level that you have this longtime baseball scribe and this old baseball pitcher just enthralled at the thought of even meeting him. So that was an amazing happening for me, and it got me started in a way that gave what I was doing, which didn't seem very legitimate to a lot of people, a degree of legitimacy. And it was really after that I got in touch with the New Press and asked about doing a book in the People's History series called A People's History of Sports in the United States. And it was like, once again, like Howard gave it his absolute blessing. And when I wrote the book, one of the things I did was I had one of those famously dog-eared copies that I'm sure many of you people have of People's History of the United States. But before I started writing the book, I reread it twice. And just because instead of reading it for the history, which at this point I was familiar with, it was, okay, what is it about this book that makes it so loved by so many people? When, you know, there's so many so-called experts in the academy who have given it short shrift for years, but at the same time, it's the book that people buy, it's the book that people lend, it's the book that sells more copies every year. What is it about this thing? So I picked it up and read it and reread it, and what I saw was that Howard writes in a way that doesn't intimidate the reader and actually makes them feel like they're part of the journey of this people's history. And he writes in a way also in these short bursts of these remarkable stories where you could literally pick it up and start in any chapter and get something really substantial out of it. And so I modeled the book after that, the People's History book, to write it in that kind of style. And that in and of itself was a lot of fun. And I really got an indication of how much that book meant to people and how people, when they read it, they feel a sense of ownership of their own history. When, towards the end of Howard's life, just 2 months before he passed, I did an event with Howard in Chicago where I interviewed him on a stage. It was one of several times we did this because his mind was sharp as a tack, but standing for a couple hours and taking questions was not what he wanted to do. So I would just interview him, I would throw him some softball questions, and he would frankly say whatever he wanted to say in response to that. And but always cogent, always clear, always sharp. And the last event we did together was in front of 1,000 people in Chicago as part of the campaign to end the death penalty convention. And a woman gave a testimonial before we spoke named Martina Correja, whose brother, Troy Davis, is on death row in Georgia. And when Martina got up there just to do a fundraising pitch for her case and speak about her experiences with her brother facing death, and she stopped for a second and looked over at Howard and she said, "You know what? I'm going to keep on fighting no matter what, so I'm in the next edition of your book when we win." And so it gives you chills to think that people can read American history, which is so alienated from so many of our lives, and read Howard's American history and all of a sudden feel like it's a part of theirs. And I'll just end on this note. Something I said to Howard at the last event we did, I said to him that he reminded me a great deal of this quote from Muhammad Ali, who once said in frustration to the press when they were asking him, "Why are you so outspoken? Why do you give yourself this new weird name? Why are you coming out against the war when you could just box for the USO and fulfill your military requirement?" And Muhammad Ali said in frustration, he said, "I don't have to be what you want me to be." And I said to Howard, that's kind of like you, because you're a historian, but you're not in some library around the books with dust. You know, you're out there with the people, you're writing plays. You have said, "I don't have to be what you want me to be." And, you know, he got a kick out of that. But the thing that I wish I'd said to him is that he's also a lot like Muhammad Ali because he was the greatest. Without question, he was the greatest. So thank you very much.
All right, in a minute or two, I'm going to open the floor to questions. So if you have any, you might want to make your way to the microphone. And while you're making your way to the microphone, I will remind you that you are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Martina Spada, Mark Favreau, and Dave Zirin, and me, Helen Atwan, discussing Howard Zinn and the freedom to write. And let's just right now open it up to discussion. If we can get our first questioner to come back to the mic, and go ahead, sir.
Okay. I'm David Fillingham. I'm in the Smed Liddy Battle Brigade of Veterans for Peace, as was Howard Zinn. And I want to thank you very much for this real treat of expanding his life and in ways that people can see. You should know that in 1990 he joined the Smed Liddy Battle Brigade here in Cambridge, and he was a very active member and very supportive of us as we were supportive of him. We've just finished a drive for an education fund in his name, and we're very, very proud of what we do, but we're doubly proud of what you folks have done. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, can you get that mic all the way down?
I guess.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks to the Pen Club, thanks to all the panelists for this wonderful event. This is not a question, this is a little tribute that I want to make. I will be short. My name is Boriana Alexandrova Tacconi. I am with a group called Merrimack Valley People for Peace, located obviously in the Merrimack Valley. We publish a little newsletter. It's not the Beacon Press, it's not the New Press, not 7 Stories. It's just a newsletter that goes to our members. For the last, I guess, 6 years, Rosalind and Howard Zinn subscribed to our newsletter after I sent them a couple of issues just because I was telling them about something that was in those issues, which means all of a sudden we got this check for $100, which is exactly 5 times as much as our membership due for 1 year, with which the newsletter comes from. And I think that we got those checks twice, with the special remark that please keep the newsletter going. And after almost every issue, I would get a note or an email, mostly written by Roz in her exuberant, wonderful style, but always signed by both, and sometimes written by Howard. And I will just read. It would have to be very short. Yeah. One little one that I got from Howard Zinn. Always the same problem. Dear Boriana, Rosalind showed me the latest newsletter of the Merrimack Valley People for Peace. It always has heartwarming pieces of good news, and I was particularly struck in this issue by Chris Hedges' piece on the current situation, an excellent statement. Also the poems, the curbside chatter, and the succinct explanation of depleted uranium. So thanks, friend Howard.
Thank you for reading.
Thank you all. Thank you, Howard.
Would love to have a question for the panel. Yes, sir. Do you have a question?
Good afternoon. I have no question. I have memory of Howard. I want to share that briefly. And I'm speaking as an American, as a Catholic, as a veteran, as a writer, as a former Catholic worker at Haley House 10 years ago. first knew Howard through his words, his written word, and then had the opportunity to spend some time with him the past 5 years. And I want to share briefly a few memories, and particularly the last time I saw Howard. He was on the way to the Friends Meeting House for a Middle East event, and he was coming down Brattle Street with a number of other writers and folks, and we sat down and talked for a couple of minutes. We were in front of the ART, and Howard's back was bothering him, so we sat there and chatted, and I turned around behind us. I said, "Look, Howard, it's Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot," and he laughed. And it was a beautiful night. That was the last time I saw him. I did hear from him again, and I want to mention that in his memory. Perhaps a year after that, I was in Philadelphia in a Greyhound bus station. I was waiting all night for a check to clear. And about 9:02 in the morning, after I left the Starbucks, I went to a bank, and a check had cleared for $500. And that check was written by Howard Zinn to me. And so I want to remember Howard. He helped me when no one else would. And I was able to complete 10 years of writing for gun safety, against gun violence. And I had been banned from a public library in this country for 2.5 years and placed on trial. Afterwards, Howard Zinn was there for me, and I remember him. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Would you have a question, or did you also want to make a statement?
Well, I was going to share both things.
Okay, then if you'll bear with me for a minute, I think I'd like to throw out a question for the panel, because I think, just bear with me. One of the things that we've heard both in all of your statements and even in some of the tributes here is Howard's advocacy for writing that some might describe as political. And yet we could be said to be living in an age, particularly post-war, of a kind of aesthetic preference in writing. So my question to all of you is, how do you think Howard's own writing and his advocacy of writers, as Martine shared with us, kind of bridged the notion of writing as pure art versus writing as a political platform? Do you want to start, Martine?
Well, I believe Howard saw no contradiction between art in the service of justice and art that was well made. You know, we often make the assumption, and I think this happens across the political spectrum, that where art has some political content, therefore aesthetics are secondary or even non-existent. The fact is that Howard did have an aesthetic. I believe it was an aesthetic of clarity. And this would be true for his own writing. This would be true for his attitudes towards fiction, towards drama, towards poetry. And by clarity, I don't mean simplicity, per se. I mean clarity in terms of thought, clarity in terms of expression, clarity at every level, which is very difficult to achieve. In fact, clarity is often underestimated. We listen to someone saying something clearly, or we read someone who is writing something clearly, and we tend to think it's easy because when it's done well, it looks effortless. It's like playing center field. You know, you see somebody out there like Jacoby Ellsbury when he doesn't have broken ribs, and you see the way he catches the ball, and you think, I could do that. And then you stand out there in that vast pasture and you watch this rock hurtling at you with what appears to be the speed of light, and you realize it's not easy at all and you're in great danger.
It's a great metaphor.
You know, the fact of the matter is that clarity is deceptively difficult to do well, whether we're talking about history, fiction, drama, or poetry. And I'm not just talking about the clarity of language, but also the clarity of ideas and the clarity of purpose. A clarity of principle. And so Howard believed in that. And of course, in the excerpt from the essay that I read, you could hear the voices within his voice. You could hear the voices that Howard was listening to and that Howard believed in. And you can hear that startling clarity, which sometimes we call epiphany. In many of the poetic passages that I read in particular. When I first read that Malay poem, again, courtesy of Howard, I understood something about myself and the world and the pursuit of justice that I did not understand before, because she was able to achieve that kind of crystalline clarity. She had been able to boil things down to their essence, as Howard so often did himself. And for me, as great a joy as it always was to read Howard Zinn, it was an even greater joy to listen to him speak. And the only other person I can think of that I've heard speak in public who achieved that kind of clarity of vision and language was James Baldwin. And I often had the privilege of watching Howard from backstage, from in the wings, because I would do programs with him together. And if you stood behind Howard and you were behind the podium, you could see something that the audience could not see. Howard would move his hands musically. And of course, the radio audience can't see what I'm doing. But there was this musicality to what he was doing. And he would move his hands beneath the podium as he spoke. There was a rhythm, a musicality, which contributed to that overall impression and projection of clarity that I'm talking about. You know, because again, clarity is far more complex than we ever give it credit for being. And this is something that I take away from Howard as an example. I used to say to Howard, I want to be you when I grow up. And Howard would say to me, you're never going to grow up. But what I meant by that is I aspire to the day when I can have the clarity of vision and the clarity of purpose and the clarity of language that was achieved by Howard Zinn.
I'll just add a quick footnote to what Martin said, which is that it's important to recall that for much of his professional life, Howard had a senior academic appointment at a university, and this doesn't always seem this way to normal people, but to embrace clarity as an objective and a discipline, and in conjunction with the level of political engagement that Howard displayed in his writing, was absolutely a risk, because it puts you at odds with your colleagues in your profession. And that always struck me, and it strikes me to this day when we display Howard's books alongside others by more traditional academics. And very many people will point to his books, let's say at a scholarly conference, and say, I wish I could do this. Very many more will say, it's it's just a simple popularization of what the rest of us are doing. And obviously that's not the case, but I think, it's an unacknowledged part of kind of Howard's person and being that he must have lived with for much of his life, and I don't know him personally, so I can't speak to it.
There was a great deal of artistry, I think, in that beautiful clarity. But also what I was impressed by and what you read for us is how he illuminated for us the political behind the artistic as well.
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, I just want to underscore what Mark said, because Howard was often dismissed within his field due to the clarity of his prose and his speech and his politics. That was seen perversely as some kind of handicap or shortcoming. And most of the people that we're referring to, the academic historians that I'm alluding to, are people who can't get from one end of a sentence to the other without losing you. As a poet, I am often faced with people who say, oh, thank God I can understand you, right? Oh, I read your poetry and I can understand it. Well, with Howard as a historian, the great revelation was not only that you could understand it, but that you weren't bored by it, right? History, as it is commonly written, is notorious for boring people into a stupor. And I think the reaction to Howard's work was not only, I wish I could do that, but more than a little bit of jealousy as well, because very few historians in this country become household names. right? And fewer still are as maybe no historian in the history of this country. I'll say that unequivocally. No historian in the history of this country has ever been as beloved as Howard Zinn. And the historians know that.
Thank you. You've been very patient, please.
It's fine, that's why I'm here. I wanted to comment, as I look at the crowd, I notice a segment of our society that's not here. I notice the children are not here. The blip was about the influence on young writers. My son is 10, but 3 years ago, I began reading to him A Young People's History. And every year we revise it and we go back over it. We're Apache, so we study the American history. And when I told him today I was going to a tribute to writers and Howard Zinn, traditionally Sunday is his day to spend with his dad, he got very excited and was like, I want to go. He's gone to see Howard Zinn speak 2 years ago and fell in love and was like, I get this. And he talks about it. He has a young people's graphic novel. And we've been reading the series as well. And I'm glad to hear there's an artist series coming out soon. My question is, when we have gatherings like this, when we have gatherings where we're talking about language, which I think is one of the strongest vehicles of education, especially for youth, how is it that presses and that people in your position, how are we speaking to that need? Because I'm not seeing, I'm one of the few of the young people here, and I'm not particularly of the youth anymore. So it concerns me as writers, as publishers, as people in the world who have a bit greater influence. How is that happening? How is it that you see your roles in vehicles in bringing voice to people?
I'm not sure. Quite sure that I understood, but Dave, you're nodding.
No, I hear what you're saying, partly because I live in Washington, D.C., and one of the centers for people to come and hear writers is a place called Busboys and Poets, and it's a terrific establishment that highlights a lot of young poets. And the bookstore is a nonprofit inside this restaurant hybrid that's a nonprofit called Teaching for Change. And they do so much work with something called the Zinn Education Project, and they put out all of these editions of what sounds like your son read about teaching a people's history and teaching for social justice and mentoring young poets and mentoring young people who have an interest in history and using Howard's work to connect with people. And my wife is also, she's a public school teacher and in a DC public school, which is as bad as it sounds, if I can say that. And the use of Howard's work has been invaluable for no other reason that young people pick it up and can understand it and feel connected to it and are excited by it. And yeah, goes back to the previous question, is that is incredibly, incredibly difficult to do, to write history that young people gravitate towards. So I think this question about how do we get young people involved, I think it's by keeping Howard's work alive as much as we can, and making sure these books get in the schools and make sure that they're taught, because I think something magic happens when a young person picks up and reads Howard's work for the first time.
And to that end, I should say also that both New Press and Seven Stories have worked with Howard on making the books, the people's history, more accessible to younger readers, as your own son saw.
In terms of bringing Howard's into a younger generation, keep in mind that Howard created thousands upon thousands of I won't say disciples, because that's not the right word, but he created thousands and thousands and thousands of followers is not the right word either. Acolytes, there you go. Howard instilled a certain set of values and a certain set of visions in tens of thousands of people who are now out there doing the same thing for other people. Whether they are teachers or community organizers or poets like myself. I've read at Busboys and Poets. I read at Busboys and Poets to young audiences. And I carry Howard Zinn wherever I go, in terms of his example, in terms of his influence, but quite literally. I talk about him and I quote from his work, and now in the wake of his passing, I've written a poem about him, which I read wherever I go and which I'll be reading later on this afternoon. Howard was very, very concerned about this, and part of his accessibility was extended to children. I can remember Howard talking to my son over dinner in Wellfleet once, and my son couldn't have been more than 10 years old, and Howard never worried about talking over your head. He assumed that his audience was intelligent and spoke accordingly. And so he looked at my son, who was all of 10, and he said, "Have you heard of a man named Eugene Debs?" I said, "No, you haven't?" And I said, "Yes, he has." But Howard went on to tell the entire story of Eugene Debs from top to bottom to my son as he listened rapt across a table where we were having dinner. And Howard reenacted the whole story to the point where he got to the trial of Eugene Debs, and he thundered, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Of course, the most famous words ever uttered by Eugene Debs, and some of the most famous words ever uttered in a courtroom in this country. And my son was absolutely transfixed. And he will carry that with him for the rest of his life. He's now 18 years old at Bennington College, and he's not a little boy anymore. In fact, he's 6'7". But he can now turn around to one of his friends in the dorm room at Bennington, and I'll bet you he can recite that speech word for word.
Thank you.
I do have a question. Preface saying Howard inspired, organized me to be against the war and my son to be a history major by reading his book, People's History, and even me to write an essay called The Logic of Withdrawal from Managed Competition, advocating for single payer, which Howard then wrote me a wonderful note and support. My question really relates to some of the comments that were just made, especially by Martin, about this clarity versus stringing these sentences together where you can't follow between the hems and the haws and the this side and then that side. And the question really is, obviously, part of that clarity derived from taking a position, from this, moving away from this sort of false, neutral objectivity to really want to say something and advocate something. And the question I have is, how did he pull this off? I think the panel is uniquely qualified in their different ways because there's this paralysis. So you have to be objective and you have to tell both sides. And people walk out just totally confused about what they really should say and do and believe. So how did he succeed in doing that and rising above that sense of paralysis and academia that holds back advocacy in the way he did?
Mark, can we let Mark Favreau start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think first and foremost, and I'm speaking here only of the people, I mean, he's written so much, but most people refer primarily to the people's history of the U.S., and I think one of the wonderful things about that book is not only the language, but just the historical vision, which Howard absolutely embraced, which is, a deeply and classically progressive one, having to do with a sort of the dynamic of conflict between people who have a great deal of wealth and privilege and those who don't, who form the great majority. And I think his ability first to see that in society and then to tell its history over time in a very nuanced and not hackneyed way. I mean, I think the commitment to a historical vision is not unlike the commitment to a sort of present-day political vision, and his ability to kind of connect those two is unlike really any other person's. I think that's partly it. So you read the book and you're able to connect the present with the past, and that's completely unique.
Yeah, that commitment to telling the story of our country and other countries from the vantage point of the people, I think, was always his strength. Go ahead, Dave, you want to say something?
Well, I just think that he had the ability, and he was very conscious of both form and content. I mean, we've talked today about academic historians and how they fail the test of teaching us our history. It's also worth saying there are and have been a lot of social historians or political historians who write works that read like just a pamphlet that's way too long. And so that's not like the key, is picking a side and knowing what side you're on and being progressive is not a key to writing great history that then people want to read and pass on to their kids. And so I think that in addition to having utter clarity as far as which side he was on, and like he always said, he said, look, the Civil War looks very different if you were a slave owner or a slave. And so he knew which side he was on in telling the story of the Civil War, for example. But in that, which is so key, is the telling the story part. I mean, and this Martine's story is wonderful about Debs and talking to his son. It's also utterly unsurprising because it's what he was a storyteller. So he was a storyteller who also knew what side he was on. The merging of form and content. And I just think he took the craft so very seriously. Just a quick story, and I just love this story. His play Marx in Soho, which is about Karl Marx coming back to planet Earth somehow in the late 20th century to comment on what was going on. It's a one-person show. It was being debuted in another country. I'm not going to say which country because I don't want to be making fun of anybody or anything. And they got a very prominent revolutionary socialist activist to play Marx on stage. And this person happened to have very long flowing hair like Karl Marx, just as a point of daily life. And they put him up there to be Marx and read the play. And he wasn't very good. He wasn't very good. And Howard sort of turned to the person he was sitting next to and he said, you know, I don't have a socialist dentist, and that's okay. So that's all. Sorry.
Great story. Yeah. I think we probably have time for 2 more questions.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking our panelists and the organizers again. I guess we've heard a couple stories today about Professor Zinn's own personal love for books. And with a couple different publishing houses represented here, the book is making a pretty strong showing. But I'm just curious how, in the age of the 24-hour news cycle, of the blog sphere, of tweets, how I'd just be interested in hearing the panelists reflect on whether or not these represent new potential frontiers for speaking truth to power, or whether this is actually just kind of the dumbing down and the condensing of otherwise thoughtful messages to 140 characters or less, and just what the potential help and hindrance to the movement might be represented in these forms of new media.
Did anyone ever get a tweet from Howard? I don't think so, no. But he was very active in writing quite a lot for online publications, for sure. Did anyone have other new media experiences with Howard?
Well, as I mentioned before, I edited the essay from which I read for the Poets Against War website. So we had begun to make use of that technology. And keep in mind that the basic answer to your question is both, or if you will, yes and no. The advantage, obviously, of the new technology is that it can communicate to a great number of people at terrifying high speed. And we can see that even posthumously, Howard's words continue to circulate online and on the internet and around the world. And you know, the last book, the book that came out after his passing about Royan, you know, that book is getting an awful lot of play now online. But also, many of the editorials, essays, or commentaries that Howard wrote are circulated over and over and over again through the Progressive magazine, for example, where he published frequently. Also through, say, commondreams.org. That's another place where you see lots of Howard's commentaries. So in that respect, Howard does continue to live on. You know, obviously, it's up to us whether or not the technology we're looking at will be a blessing or a curse, whether it saves humanity or helps to destroy it.
Well, but I want to add a footnote, which is if ever there was an argument for the existence of the book as opposed to the blog, it might be the People's History of the United States, because he could not have told that story in fewer words than he did. And every word of that book is valuable. So, you know, that is a great argument for the vitality of the full-length book. Thanks for your question.
Yes. Coincidentally, my question had to do with the impact of the internet on the book.
Can you pull the mic down?
Oh,
just push it
you.
down.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yes, coincidentally, my question was addressing the impact of the internet on the book. And more precisely, I'm concerned, I was thinking about the image that I had when Martin Espada talked about carrying Howard Zinn's book in his pocket. And for me, when speaking to Howard Zinn and reading Howard Zinn, it's the matter of intimacy that comes up. There's not only clarity to his writing and to his speaking and to his associations, but there's a kind of intimacy that comes with carrying a book in paper print. Original, not digitized and then regurgitated, but original. And I wondered if you could just inch it up a bit and fine-tune it more precisely based on your answer to the previous questioner, to say what you think will be the impact on our new and up-and-coming generation, our young people who are some not even learning to use cursive, in associating the feeling of intimacy to the printed page with an electronic vehicle, as opposed to the book that one carries in one pocket. I mean, I can't imagine sliding my hand and feeling an electronical apparatus over a paper-printed book.
You could fit People's History in your pocket.
Okay, no, but I mean, could you say a few words? I think you know what I'm trying to get to, and I know we're running out of time. Okay? Thank you.
It's a great topic, and I don't think it's one that can be treated in a few words, but I'm looking at Mark and thinking, do you want to toss in some comments as a publisher?
Sure. Where I would differ from you a little bit would be that we're committed as a publisher to the kind of importance of long-form texts, and increasingly we're publishing those electronically. I mean, most of our books are sold as these beautiful physical objects, but I do think there's been a real shift where people, even who had for decades been accustomed to holding beautiful books, are increasingly willing to read them on iPhones and other things. And actually that's fine with me, it's fine with a lot of other publishers, because what we have found is that in this age of fragmentation, that this long-form, you know, narrative, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, actually has a certain gravity to it. I mean, sometimes we get more rather than less attention than we would have 20 years ago for a book, because there's so much ferment out there, there's so much comment, and there's an ability to engage with books that wasn't there. So I'm not so worried about the format, but we do know concretely that our readership is not a young one. The readership for serious nonfiction is an aging readership, and I'm part of the aging demographic for certain, and that to the extent that we've polled this and that the industry has more broadly, that people coming out of college now tend not to read long form nonfiction. So I think that's an enormous challenge. I don't know what that means for us 20 years down the road, but it's those two things work hand in hand at the same time. So
again, a very thorny, complex issue that we could easily spend another hour and a half talking about. But what I'd like to do is to conclude our remembrance of Howard Zinn and his impact on our writing and reading lives by asking Martine to read his poem for Howard Zinn.
This poem is called Walking, for Howard Zinn, 1922 to 2010, And it begins with an epigraph. I go 2 steps closer. She moves 2 steps away. I walk 10 steps and the horizon runs 10 steps ahead. No matter how much I walk, I'll never reach her. What good is utopia? That's what. It's good for walking. Eduardo Galeano. You walked alone, away from the city writhing in flames and jellied gasoline, away from the canisters of napalm dropped by your bombardier's hands, away from medals and ribbons stuffed in a folder with the words, never again. Walking the back roads in a country of Confederate flags, shoes baked in mud, shuffling on the picket line with dark-skinned sharecroppers, teachers, organizers who hungered for the ballot box and sang all night to keep their jailers awake. Walking with apparitions, the escaped slave reading the compass of the moon between the trees, the anarchist in spectacles who made of the crowd a roaring sea, the union man on trial for subversion of the draft who confessed the crime and told the judge with open hands, while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Walking through the metal detectors of courthouses and airports, smuggling manifestos in your head from the slave, the anarchist, the unionist, words freed as a magician frees doves flown to the rafters from the great stage of the world. Walking through schoolrooms, the smooth oval of faces tilted up, astonished by your words as they floated down like parachutes of milkweed on the wind. Walking by the river with the fugitive poet priest who sang of the risen bread as agents of the government hunted for the poet everywhere but the river. Walking through the mace that hissed in your eyes at the march against the war, the cuffs that clicked, the billy clubs that jabbed the ribs of your thin body. Walking in the circle of the peace vigil on the town common at noon, past the jeers and staring of the onlookers who know that nothing changes. Walking when your legs trembled in the storm of nerves crushed by the spine, when you knew you would never arrive, that the world was too bright with ice for a fistful of sand and careful steps, and yet your fingers still tapped out the messages of dissidence as you spoke, darting with the delirium of sparrows, walking with thousands beside you now, a roaring sea, down the road to a city where they greet you with blackberries that grow wild in the ruins, where scars of liquid fire dissolve into the skin, where the bombs will never fall again.
Thank you so much for that wonderful poem, Martin Espada. And thanks also to Mark Favreau and David Zirin, to Richard Hoffman, Chair of Penn New England, to Karen Wolf, Executive Director of Penn New England. Thank you for helping us make this program possible. You have been listening to Howard Zinn and the Freedom to Write, recorded by the Cambridge Forum on October 2010 and co-sponsored by Penn New England, Amnesty International, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the First Parish in Cambridge, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this program or information about our ongoing radio series and our forum webcasts, visit Cambridge Forum on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Helen Atwan. Thanks for joining us.